Weekend update. Trump ousts Bondi over Epstein files, warns he'll send Iran back to the Stone Age. All right. Two things happened this week that the mainstream media is treating as separate stories. They're not. They're connected. And when you understand the connection, when you see what's actually moving underneath the surface of both of these moments, you'll realize that what we're watching right now is the most consequential 72-hour stretch of this administration since it began. Pam Bondi is out. Iran is being threatened with annihilation. And somewhere between those two headlines is a document trail that nobody is talking about completely. So let's start with Bondi, because her departure isn't the story. It's what her departure reveals about the story nobody wanted told. When Pam Bondi was confirmed as Attorney General, the Epstein file question was already in the room. Senators asked about it directly. Her answers were careful, measured. She committed to transparency in ways that sounded meaningful in the moment and looked different in hindsight. Because here's what happened in the weeks that followed. The files didn't move. The names didn't surface. The documents that survivors, journalists, and congressional members had been pushing toward public release stayed exactly where they'd been, buried, categorized, redacted into near uselessness. That wasn't an accident. There is a reason specific people inside the Justice Department wanted those files to stay closed. There is a reason every attempt to accelerate the declassification process ran into procedural walls that seemed to appear from nowhere. And there is a reason that when pressure finally reached a point where something had to give, it wasn't the files that moved. It was Bondi. Think about what that means. Because if the files were just a bureaucratic backlog, if the delay was just about logistics and legal review timelines, then removing the Attorney General wouldn't be the answer. You don't fire the head of a department because paperwork is slow. You remove someone when they're the reason the paperwork isn't moving. And the distinction between those two things is everything. Sources close to the situation describe a White House that had grown increasingly frustrated with Justice Department foot-dragging on multiple fronts. But the Epstein file issue wasn't just one item on a list. It was the item. Because those files don't just contain information about Jeffrey Epstein. They contain information about the people Jeffrey Epstein knew, the people who visited his properties, the people whose names appear in documents that have been partially released and mostly redacted, the people who have spent years and significant resources ensuring that full transparency never arrived. Some of those people are powerful. Some of those people have relationships with this administration that are complicated, and some of those people were banking on an attorney general who understood that certain doors are better left closed. Bondi understood that, until she didn't. Or more precisely, until the people above her decided the calculation had changed. Here's what changed. Congressional pressure on the Epstein files reached a threshold in the past 60 days that made the status quo untenable. Members from both parties, an increasingly rare alignment, started asking questions in hearings that couldn't be answered with the standard responses. The documents you're asking about are under review. We're committed to appropriate transparency. The process is ongoing. Those answers work for one cycle, 2 cycles, maybe 3. They stop working when the members asking the questions start bringing specific document numbers, specific redaction patterns, specific discrepancies between what was promised and what was delivered. That's what happened. And when it happened, the Justice Department's position became a liability rather than a shield. Bondi's ouster isn't about one specific document or one specific conversation. It's about the judgment that she had become associated with a posture toward the Epstein files that was no longer politically sustainable. In Washington, when a position becomes unsustainable, you don't defend it. You change the person holding it and let the new person take a different posture while pretending continuity. Watch what the next Attorney General says about the Epstein files in their first week. Watch whether the language shifts. Watch whether the declassification timeline suddenly accelerates. Because if it does, that tells you everything about why Bondi had to go. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't scandal. It was specific, deliberate resistance to a specific, politically necessary release, and that resistance expired. Now let's talk about Iran. Because the timing here is not coincidental, and the people treating it as coincidental are not paying attention. The statement that Trump will send Iran back to the Stone Age if nuclear negotiations fail is not a new threat. Escalatory language toward Iran has been part of this administration's diplomatic posture since day one. What's different about this particular statement issued in this particular week is the specific context surrounding it. 2 days before that statement landed, there were reports of internal disagreement within the administration about how to handle the Iranian nuclear file. The disagreement wasn't about whether to be tough. Everyone agrees on that. The disagreement was about what tough actually means in practice. There are people inside this administration who believe that maximum pressure through sanctions and diplomatic isolation is the correct approach. And there are people who believe that military options need to be visibly on the table in a way that goes beyond rhetoric. That internal disagreement doesn't usually reach the public. When it does reach the public in the form of a presidential statement threatening to send a country back to the Stone Age, it means the debate has been resolved. Someone won the argument. And the person who won decided that the winning needed to be visible. Understanding who won that argument and why requires understanding what's actually happening in the Iranian nuclear negotiations right now. Because despite the maximalist public language, there are negotiations happening. Quiet ones, indirect ones. The kind that serious diplomatic actors always maintain even when the public posture is confrontational. And those negotiations have been complicated by several factors that don't appear in the public statements. First, the Iranian position has shifted more than Western analysis typically acknowledges. There are factions inside the Iranian government that want a deal, not a capitulation. Not the kind of arrangement that looks like defeat on the evening news in Tehran, but a structured de-escalation that gives them economic relief while preserving enough of their nuclear posture to look like a negotiated outcome rather than a surrender. Those factions exist. They have influence. And they've been quietly signaling through back channels that a certain range of outcomes might be acceptable. Second, the Israeli factor. Israel has been increasingly direct about its own timeline for tolerating Iranian nuclear progress. The statements coming out of Tel Aviv in recent weeks have not been subtle. And when Israel sets timelines publicly, those timelines create constraints for the American position, whether Washington chooses to acknowledge them or not. Third, and this is the part that connects everything, the domestic political calculation. Trump's base wants strength on Iran. Full stop. They want language that doesn't sound like the hedged, qualified diplomatic speak of previous administrations. They want someone who will say directly what previous presidents only implied. Sending Iran back to the Stone Age is exactly that kind of statement. It lands differently than measured statements about consequences and options. It lands like a president who means it. The question serious analysts are asking right now is whether it's positioning or policy. Whether the Stone Age language is designed to move the negotiating room or designed to foreclose it. And the honest answer is that it can be both simultaneously. You can use maximum public pressure to improve your negotiating position while also meaning every word of the threat if the position doesn't improve. That ambiguity is actually the strategy, because Iran can't be certain which version is true. Their negotiators are sitting in rooms right now trying to read the gap between what Trump says publicly and what the administration's actual red lines are. And when that gap is unclear, when the public statements are maximalist enough that you can't tell where the theater ends and the actual policy begins, the party being pressured has to assume the worst case is real. That's leverage. Uncomfortable, volatile, potentially catastrophic if misread, but leverage. Now here's the piece that pulls both stories together. The Bondi removal and the Iran statement dropped within 72 hours of each other. In an administration that understands media cycles, that doesn't happen by accident. When you want to change the subject, you create a new subject. When you want a story about personnel to be swallowed by a bigger story about national security, you release the national security story within the same window. Whether that sequencing was intentional depends on how much strategic communication discipline you believe this White House actually exercises. There are days when the answer is quite a lot. And there are days when the chaos is genuine and the sequencing is coincidental. This week looked more like the former. The Bondi story had legs, it had documents, it had congressional members who weren't done asking questions, and suddenly there was a statement about sending Iran back to the Stone Age. The Bondi story didn't disappear. Stories like that don't disappear in this environment. But it got compressed, it got pushed to paragraph 4 instead of paragraph 1. And in the news cycle economy, paragraph 4 is where stories start dying. What doesn't die is the underlying document question, because Bondi's replacement will be asked the same questions about the Epstein files. The congressional members who were pushing haven't stopped pushing. The survivors whose names and stories are connected to those documents haven't stopped demanding transparency. The journalists who have spent years mapping the network of individuals whose lives intersect with those files haven't stopped publishing. The personnel change buys time, it doesn't buy resolution. And the people in this town who understand how these cycles work know that bought time has a price. Whoever comes into the Attorney General's chair next inherits both the opportunity and the risk. The opportunity to be the person who finally allowed the transparency that the previous holder blocked. The risk of being the person who actually deals with what that transparency reveals. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that very few people in Washington are willing to say out loud. The Epstein files are not just about Epstein. They're about accountability. And accountability in this particular case runs through corridors of power that don't respect party lines. The names in those documents are not all from one team. The connections don't map onto one political narrative. That's why every administration that has touched this question has found reasons to slow walk it. Not because of partisan protection, because of bipartisan exposure. The next Attorney General will face the same pressure the previous one faced, with one difference. The baseline has shifted. The public has watched one Attorney General get removed in a context where the Epstein files were part of the conversation. That creates a precedent, a visible one. And visible precedents change the political cost calculation for the next person in the chair. As for Iran, the next 60 days will tell you more than this week's statement did. Watch whether the back-channel negotiations produce any movement. Watch whether Israel's timeline creates a forcing function that the administration has to respond to publicly. Watch whether the Stone Age language gets hardened into policy or walked back into posture. And watch whether the two stories, the ousted Attorney General and the maximum pressure Iran strategy, turn out to be as separate as the weekend coverage suggests. Because in Washington, nothing that happens within 72 hours of something else is fully separate. The connections aren't always intentional, but they're always there. And right now, the connections running underneath both of these stories point toward the same pressure point. A government trying to manage too many volatile situations simultaneously, making decisions about which fires to fight and which to let burn, hoping the sequencing holds long enough for something to resolve. It rarely does, not cleanly, not in a way that looks like resolution from the outside. But the documents exist, the negotiations are happening, and the people whose names appear in both sets of records are watching this week very carefully. That's what the weekend update doesn't tell you. But now you know.